Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can awaken the deepest parts of our souls. In a world where cruelty often overshadows compassion, one woman's selfless choice would forever change the heart of a monster. Deep in a snow-covered forest, Elira finds a dying stranger and gives him her last vial of precious medicine without thinking twice. She doesn't know that watching from the shadows is Kaelen, an ancient vampire who has killed countless souls over the centuries. But when he sees her act of pure mercy, something stirs inside him that he thought was dead forever. For the first time in ages, the bloodthirsty predator remembers what it felt like to be human. What happens when a simple act of compassion forces an immortal killer to face the man he used to be? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cottage stood like a sentinel against the encroaching wilderness, its thatched roof heavy with snow that had fallen steadily for 3 days. Smoke curled from the chimney in lazy spirals, carrying with it the scent of dried herbs and simmering broths that had become Elira's signature throughout the valley. Inside, bundles of lavender and sage hung from the rafters like ancient prayers, their fragrance mingling with the warmth of the crackling fire. Elira moved through her domain with practiced grace, her fingers trailing over glass vials filled with tinctures that caught the firelight like captured stars. Each bottle held a story. Feverfew for the baker's wife, who suffered terrible headaches, willow bark extract for old Henrik's aching joints, and chamomile for little Sarah, who couldn't sleep since her father went to war. This was her mother's legacy, passed down through generations of women who had chosen healing over wealth, service over comfort. The leather-bound grimoire lay open on the oak table, its pages yellowed with age and wisdom. Elira traced the familiar script of her mother's handwriting, each recipe a testament to countless nights spent learning the delicate balance between life and death. "Remember, my dear one," her mother's voice echoed in memory, "a healer's greatest tool is not her knowledge of plants, but her willingness to sacrifice for those who suffer." Elena had been the finest herbalist the valley had ever known, revered by peasants and nobles alike. When the plague swept through the region 10 years ago, she had worked tirelessly, never asking for payment, never turning away the desperate. She had saved hundreds of lives, only to lose her own to the very disease she fought so valiantly to cure. Elira found her one morning, peaceful in her chair, the silver locket with the pressed moonflower still warm against her chest. That locket now rested against Elira's heart, a constant reminder of the woman who had taught her that true strength came from gentleness, that real power flowed from selfless love. Inside the delicate silver case, the pressed flower had retained its ethereal beauty, its petals still holding traces of the magic that moonflowers were said to possess. Her mother had picked it on the night of Elira's birth, claiming it would guide her daughter toward her destiny. The village of Millbrook lay 3 miles down the winding forest path, nestled in a valley where the river ran clear and the soil yielded abundant harvests. It was a simple place where everyone knew their neighbors' troubles and joys, where children played in cobblestone streets while their parents worked trades passed down through generations. The villagers looked to Elira as they had once looked to her mother, with respect, gratitude, and sometimes desperation that broke her heart. Young Thomas had been the latest to seek her help, arriving at her door just as the sun disappeared behind the snow-laden peaks. His little sister had developed a persistent cough that worsened with each passing day, and the village physician had exhausted his limited remedies. Elira had given the boy her second-to-last vial of her mother's most potent cough elixir. watching his face transform from worry to hope as he clutched the precious medicine to his chest. "How can I repay you?" he had asked, his voice thick with gratitude. "By taking care of your sister and remembering that kindness should always be passed forward," Elira had replied, just as her mother would have done. Now, as the wind howled through the pine trees that surrounded her cottage, Elira examined her remaining supplies with growing concern. The harsh winter had made it impossible to gather fresh herbs, and her stores were dangerously low. Most troubling of all, she possessed only one vial of her mother's legendary healing elixir, a complex preparation that required rare ingredients and months of careful aging. The recipe called for moonflowers that bloomed only during the winter solstice, spring water blessed by morning frost, and a dozen other components that would be impossible to obtain until the snows melted. She held the crystalline bottle up to the firelight, watching the golden liquid swirl with its own inner luminescence. This was more than medicine. It was liquid hope, capable of pulling someone back from death's very threshold. Her mother had used it sparingly, saving it for the most desperate cases, and Elira had followed that tradition faithfully. But now, with winter tightening its grip and sickness spreading through the valley, she wondered if she was being too cautious with such powerful healing. The storm outside intensified, rattling the shutters and sending drafts through the gaps in the walls. Elira wrapped her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved to check the fire. As she stirred the glowing embers, her mind wandered to the stories her mother used to tell during long winter nights. Tales of ancient magic that still lingered in the deep forests, of creatures both wonderful and terrible that walked beneath the stars. One story in particular had always captivated young Elira's imagination. Her mother spoke of a time when vampires ruled the dark places of the world, beings of such terrible power that entire kingdoms lived in fear of their wrath. But among these monsters, there had been one who was different, a lord who had once shown mercy to a village healer, sparing her life when all around him counseled death. Eleanor had told this story with such vivid detail that Elira sometimes wondered if her mother had known more than she revealed. The legend spoke of redemption as a possibility even for the most fallen souls, but it came with a price that few were willing to pay. A vampire could be freed from his curse, but only through an act of perfect love and sacrifice, witnessed under the light of a winter moon. Most dismissed such tales as fantasy, but Elira's mother had always insisted that magic was simply love made manifest, that the greatest miracles occurred when someone loved deeply enough to risk everything for another's well-being. As midnight approached, Elira found herself drawn to the window. The forest beyond lay shrouded in white silence, broken only by the occasional crack of an overburdened branch surrendering to winter's weight. Something stirred in her chest, a restlessness that had been growing stronger with each passing day. It was as if the very air held expectation, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for something momentous to occur. She thought of Marcus, the traveling merchant who had passed through the village earlier that week. He had been a kind man with gentle eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. His stories of the wider world had fascinated the villagers, but Elira had been most moved by his devotion to his family. He carried a torn portrait of his wife and children, showing it to anyone who would listen as he spoke of their love with such tender pride that it brought tears to her eyes. Marcus had been traveling to the northern settlements, seeking a rare medicine for his youngest daughter, who suffered from a wasting disease that no healer in his homeland could cure. He had heard rumors of a legendary herbalist in these mountains, Elena of Millbrook, not knowing that she had passed away years ago. Elira had been heartbroken to disappoint him, but she had shared what knowledge she could and sent him on his way with herbal preparations that might ease his daughter's suffering, though they were not the miracle cure he sought. That had been 3 days ago, and the storm had worsened considerably since then. If Marcus had continued his journey into the higher elevations, he could well be in serious danger. The mountain passes were treacherous even in good weather, and winter storms had claimed many travelers over the years. Local legends spoke of an ancient evil that dwelt in the high peaks. Lord Kaelen, the vampire who ruled from a castle carved into the living rock itself. For 8 centuries, Kaelen had been the shadow that haunted the mountain regions. Villages paid tribute to avoid his wrath, and travelers disappeared with disturbing regularity. Unlike the vampires of distant lands, who were said to be mindless beasts driven by hunger, Kaelen possessed a keen intelligence that made him infinitely more dangerous. He ruled through fear and calculation, maintaining a network of human servants who carried out his will in exchange for protection from his supernatural appetite. The stories described him as a figure of terrible beauty, tall and commanding, with eyes like fresh blood and a voice that could charm or terrify with equal skill. His castle was said to be filled with treasures stolen from his victims over the centuries, but also with implements of torture that spoke to his cruel nature. No one who entered his domain uninvited ever returned to tell the tale. Yet tonight, as Elira stared into the swirling snow, she felt an inexplicable pull toward the forest. Perhaps it was concern for Marcus, or perhaps it was something deeper, a sense that her destiny lay waiting among the silent trees. Her mother's locket seemed to pulse against her chest, its warmth spreading through her like a gentle reminder of the courage that flowed in her veins. The grimoire lay open to a page her mother had marked with a pressed violet, its petals still retaining their deep purple hue after all these years. The recipe detailed there was for a traveling preparation, herbs and tinctures that could sustain a healer during long journeys through dangerous territory. Elira had never had reason to prepare it before, but something urged her to gather the necessary components now. As she worked by candlelight, combining dried roots and bottled essences into her leather traveling pouch, the storm outside began to shift. The wind's howl took on an almost musical quality, and the snow seemed to fall in patterns that reminded her of the ancient dances her mother had taught her. Magic was stirring in the air. She was certain of it, the kind of deep, transformative power that appeared only when the world stood at the edge of great change. By the time she finished her preparations, dawn was still hours away, but Elira knew with absolute certainty that she would not see another sunrise from the safety of her cottage. Something was calling her into the night, into the heart of the storm, where fate and choice would intersect in ways she could not yet imagine. She wrapped her mother's heaviest cloak around her shoulders, tucked the precious last vial of healing elixir into her breast pocket next to the silver locket, and stepped out into the waiting darkness. The forest embraced her like an old friend, its familiar paths now transformed by snow into a landscape of mystery and wonder. Each footstep carried her further from the known world and deeper into the realm where legends lived and breathed. Behind her, the cottage's windows glowed like earthbound stars, a beacon of warmth and safety that grew smaller with each step she took toward her destiny. Elira did not look back. Something told her that by morning, nothing would ever be the same again. The forest path disappeared beneath Elira's feet as the storm intensified, transforming the familiar trail into an alien landscape of shifting white. Snow fell in thick curtains that muffled all sound except the crunch of her boots and the whisper of wind through bare branches. Her breath formed crystalline clouds that dissipated quickly in the bitter air, and despite her heavy cloak, the cold began to seep through her clothing with relentless persistence. She had been walking for nearly an hour when she saw the dark shape ahead, a shadow against the pristine snow that didn't belong to any tree or boulder she recognized. As she drew closer, her heart lurched with recognition and horror. A man lay motionless in a shallow depression beside the path, his traveling clothes dusted with snow and his face pale as moonlight. "Marcus," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. The merchant's lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and his breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. Ice crystals clung to his beard, and his hands were curled into rigid claws against his chest. But what alarmed Elira most was the dark stain spreading across his side. Blood, partially frozen, but still seeping through a tear in his coat where something sharp had pierced his flesh. She pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse, and found it, weak and thready, but present. He was alive, but barely. Without immediate intervention, he would be dead within the hour. The wound appeared to be from a blade, though whether from bandits or wild animals with claws, she couldn't determine in the dim light. Elira's mind raced through her options. She could attempt to drag him back to her cottage, but he was far too heavy, and the exertion would likely kill them both in this weather. She could try to tend his wounds here, but her basic supplies would not be sufficient for injuries this severe. Then her hand found the crystalline vial in her breast pocket, her mother's final gift, the last dose of the legendary healing elixir. This was exactly the kind of situation her mother had prepared it for, exactly the desperate circumstance that demanded the ultimate sacrifice. But once used, it would be gone forever. There would be no more miracles in her medicine bag, no final resort for the next person who needed saving. The thought of facing the future without this safety net filled her with a fear that had nothing to do with the storm raging around them. Marcus stirred weakly, his eyes fluttering open to fix on her face with desperate confusion. "Please," he managed to whisper through cracked lips. "My daughter. She needs the medicine. I have to reach." His words dissolved into a coughing fit that brought up flecks of blood. The decision crystallized in Elira's heart with perfect clarity. This man had risked everything for love, had ventured into deadly territory because his child needed healing. How could she, who had been blessed with the power to save him, choose safety over compassion? Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. A healer's greatest tool is not her knowledge of plants, but her willingness to sacrifice for those who suffer. With steady hands, she uncorked the precious vial and lifted Marcus's head gently. "Drink this," she murmured, pressing the bottle to his lips. "It will help you." The golden liquid caught what little light filtered through the storm clouds, seeming to glow with its own inner fire. Marcus swallowed weakly, and almost immediately, color began to return to his cheeks. The bleeding slowed, then stopped entirely, and his breathing deepened into something resembling natural sleep rather than the gasping struggle of moments before. Elira sat back on her heels, watching the miracle unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and profound loss. The vial in her hands was empty now, its crystalline surface reflecting the swirling snow like a window into the void. She had made her choice, and she would live with the consequences, whatever they might be. How touching! The voice came from the darkness beyond the trees, rich and melodious with an undertone that made her blood freeze in her veins. Elira spun around, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing except the endless dance of falling snow. Then the wind shifted, and she caught a scent that didn't belong in the winter forest, something like copper and midnight, ancient and terrible. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice carrying more strength than she felt. Laughter drifted through the air, neither cruel nor kind, but filled with genuine amusement. Someone who has watched many acts of mercy over the centuries, but few as pure as what I have just witnessed. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the very forest was speaking. A figure emerged from behind a massive pine tree, moving with fluid grace that defied the treacherous footing. He was tall and imposing, wrapped in a cloak so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His face was aristocratic and ageless, with sharp cheekbones and pale skin that suggested nobility, but his eyes were the deep red of fresh blood, burning with an inner fire that marked him as something far removed from humanity. Elira's breath caught in her throat as recognition crashed over her like an avalanche. Lord Kaelen, the vampire of legend, stood before her, as real as the snow beneath her knees. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her body refused to obey, frozen by a terror so primal it reached into her very soul. "You know who I am," Kaelen observed, his lips curving in what might have been a smile on a human face. "I can smell your fear, little healer. It's quite intoxicating." "Why, haven't you killed us?" The words escaped Elira's lips before she could stop them, surprising them both with their boldness. Kaelen tilted his head, studying her with the focused intensity of a predator examining prey. "An excellent question. I came here tonight expecting to find an easy meal, a lost traveler perhaps, or a foolish villager who wandered too far from safety. Instead, I discovered something far more interesting." He moved closer, and Elira could see details that human eyes should not have been able to discern in the darkness. His features were beautiful in the way that deadly things often were, perfect and terrible and utterly captivating. But there was something else in his expression, something she couldn't quite identify. Confusion? Curiosity? Or perhaps something deeper, something buried beneath centuries of calculated cruelty. "You gave him your most precious possession," Kaelen continued, gesturing toward the empty vial in her hands. "I could sense its power from half a mile away, magic that pure is rare in this world. You could have saved it for yourself, could have used it to bargain for your life when you inevitably faced mortal danger. Instead, you poured it down the throat of a stranger without a moment's hesitation." "He needed it more than I did," Elira replied simply. "But you don't even know him. Does that matter?" The question hung between them in the swirling snow, and for a moment something flickered across the vampire's perfect features, a crack in the mask of cold amusement he wore. It was gone so quickly that Elira might have imagined it, but she didn't think she had. Kaelen crouched down beside Marcus, his movements unnaturally smooth and silent. He studied the sleeping merchant with an expression that was impossible to read, then reached out with one pale finger to touch the man's forehead. Marcus stirred but didn't wake, lost in healing dreams. "He's dreaming of his daughter," Kaelen said softly. "A little girl with golden curls and her father's gentle eyes. She's been sick for months, wasting away despite all the healer's efforts. He's traveled farther than any man should to find help for her, driven by a love so fierce it burns like a star in the darkness of his mind." Elira stared at the vampire in shock. "How can you know that?" "I can sense thoughts and emotions as easily as you can smell flowers. It's one of many gifts that come with immortality." His red eyes fixed on her face. "But I have never encountered a mortal whose thoughts were so purely focused on another's well-being. His love for his child is—" Kaelen paused, seeming to struggle with words. "It's beautiful and terrible, and completely foreign to everything I have become." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did Elira. For 800 years, Kaelen had been the shadow that haunted these mountains, the monster that parents invoked to frighten disobedient children. He had killed without mercy, fed without conscience, and ruled through terror that kept entire regions in thrall. Yet here he knelt in the snow, speaking of love and beauty, with something that sounded almost like longing. "You're not what I expected," Elira said quietly. "Neither are you, little healer. Neither are you." The storm continued to rage around them, but in the small clearing where 3 unlikely souls had converged, the night held its breath. Change was coming. Elira could feel it in the air like the charge before lightning strikes. Whatever happened next would alter the course of all their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. Marcus slept peacefully between them, saved by compassion and watched over by predator and healer alike. The last vial was empty, but somehow Elira felt that the real miracle was only just beginning. The silence stretched between them like a bridge across an abyss, fragile and uncertain. Kaelen remained crouched beside Marcus, his pale hands hovering just above the merchant's chest, as if he could feel the life force flowing through mortal veins. The bloodstone ring on his finger pulsed with a dark radiance that seemed to respond to his emotional state, its crimson glow intensifying with each passing moment. For 8 centuries, that ring had been the symbol of his authority, carved from the heart of a fallen star and bound with magic older than memory. It had grown heavier with each life he claimed, each village he terrorized, each act of cruelty that fed his supernatural power. Now, watching this simple woman tend to a stranger with such gentle care, the ring felt like a chain around his soul. "You're afraid," Elira observed quietly, her healer's instincts reading the tension in his stillness. Kaelen's red eyes snapped to her face, and for an instant she saw something raw and vulnerable there before his mask of control slammed back into place. "Vampires don't feel fear, little healer. We are apex predators. We are death incarnate." "Then why are your hands shaking?" He looked down at his fingers, startled to discover that she was right. The tremor was barely perceptible, but it was there. A crack in the facade of supernatural composure he had maintained for longer than most civilizations had existed. With deliberate effort, he stilled the movement, but the damage was done. She had seen through him, past the legend and the terror, to something painfully human beneath. "You remind me of someone," he said finally, the words dragging from him like a confession under torture. Elira waited, sensing that pushing would only make him retreat further behind his walls of ice and shadow. Instead, she focused on Marcus, checking his pulse and adjusting his position to keep him warm. The healing elixir had done its work. The wound was completely sealed, and his breathing had returned to normal, but she knew from experience that magical healing could be draining. He would need time to recover his strength. Kaelen watched her careful ministrations with growing fascination. There was no calculation in her movements, no thought of reward or recognition. She simply saw suffering and moved to alleviate it, as naturally as breathing. It was a trait he had encountered perhaps a dozen times in his long existence, and each instance had left him more unsettled than the last. "Her name was Lyanna," he said suddenly, the words escaping like steam from a pressure valve. She was much like you." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with 800 years of buried grief. Elira's hands stilled on Marcus's cloak, but she didn't look up, somehow understanding that direct attention would shatter whatever fragile trust was building between them. She was a healer too, Elira asked softly. A midwife, Kaelen replied, his voice taking on a distant quality as memory pulled him back across the centuries. In the village where I was born, when I was still human. The bloodstone ring pulsed more rapidly now, as if feeding on the pain that welled up from the deepest parts of his consciousness. Kaelen could feel its hunger, its desire to transform his anguish into the cold fury that had sustained him for so long. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't fathom, he resisted its pull. I was Lord Kaelen Blackthorn then, heir to lands that stretched from the mountain peaks to the river valleys. My father ruled justly, and I was raised to follow in his footsteps, to protect our people, to govern with wisdom and compassion. His lips twisted in a bitter mockery of a smile. Such noble ideals seem laughable now, don't they? Elira finally looked at him, and her eyes held no judgment, only patient attention. It had been centuries since anyone had listened to him speak of anything other than threats or demands. The simple act of being heard was almost overwhelming. Lyanna was the daughter of the village wise woman, trained in the arts of healing from childhood. She had hair like sunlight and eyes the color of spring leaves. But more than her beauty, it was her gentle spirit that captured my heart. She could coax life from the most hopeless cases, could ease pain with a touch, could make anyone believe that tomorrow would be better than today. The snow continued to fall around them, but Kaelen seemed oblivious to the cold. He was lost in memories of warmth and light, of a time when his heart had beaten with human rhythm and his soul had known the meaning of joy. We were to be married in the spring, he continued, his voice growing softer with each word. I had commissioned a gown from the finest seamstresses in the capital, and she had laughed when she saw the sketches, saying it was far too grand for a simple village healer. But she deserved grandeur. She deserved everything beautiful the world could offer. Elira felt tears prick at her eyes, though she didn't fully understand why. Perhaps it was the raw pain in his voice, or the way his perfect features seemed to crumble under the weight of ancient sorrow. This was not the monster of legend. This was a man remembering the best part of himself, the part he had lost to forces beyond his understanding. "What happened to her?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer would break her heart. "The plague," Kaelen whispered, and the word fell between them like a stone into still water, sending ripples of anguish in all directions. It swept through our lands like wildfire, killing indiscriminately. Rich and poor, young and old, righteous and wicked. The disease cared nothing for station or virtue. Lyanna threw herself into caring for the sick, working day and night to save as many as she could. His hands clenched into fists, and the bloodstone ring flared with malevolent light. The memory was as sharp and agonizing as the day it had happened, undulled by the passage of time or the numbness he had cultivated to survive it. I begged her to flee with me to the mountains, to wait out the plague in safety while others tended the sick. But she refused. She said her duty was to her people, that she could never live with herself if she abandoned them in their hour of greatest need. Her compassion was her greatest strength, and ultimately it became her doom. The parallel to Elira's own actions was not lost on either of them. Here was another woman choosing sacrifice over safety, duty over self-preservation. The similarities were so striking that for a moment Kaelen wondered if fate was playing some cosmic jest, forcing him to relive his greatest failure through new eyes. "She died in my arms," he concluded, his voice barely audible above the wind. 3 days before our wedding, after nursing hundreds back to health, She succumbed to the very plague she had fought so valiantly. With her last breath, she made me promise to care for our people as she had cared for them, to be the leader they needed in the dark times ahead. Elira understood now why her simple act of mercy had affected him so profoundly. In saving Marcus, she had embodied everything Kaelen had once loved and lost, everything pure and selfless that had been torn from his life by cruel fate. "You kept your promise," she said gently. Kaelen's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Did I? Look at what I've become, little healer. Look at the monster that crawled from the ashes of that broken promise." Marcus stirred as the magical healing completed its work, his eyes fluttering open to reveal the deep brown irises of a man who had known both great joy and profound worry. He attempted to sit up, wincing slightly at the residual stiffness in his limbs, but the mortal wound that had been bleeding his life away was now nothing more than a memory sealed beneath unblemished skin. "Easy," Elira murmured, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "The medicine was powerful, but your body needs time to adjust." Marcus's gaze moved from her concerned face to the imposing figure of Kaelen, who had retreated slightly, but remained within the circle of their small clearing. Fear flickered in the merchant's eyes. Any sane person would recognize the supernatural nature of the being before them, but it was quickly replaced by something unexpected. Gratitude. "You saved my life," he said to Elira, his voice hoarse but steady. "Both of you, I suspect." "She saved you," Kaelen replied curtly, though his tone lacked its earlier menace. "I merely chose not to interfere." Marcus struggled to a sitting position, reaching inside his torn coat with careful movements. He withdrew a leather portfolio, its edges worn smooth by countless miles of travel, and from within it produced a small painting, wrapped in oiled cloth. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the protective covering, revealing a portrait that had clearly been damaged and lovingly repaired multiple times. The painting showed a woman with kind eyes and graying hair standing beside two children, a boy of perhaps 10 years and a girl who couldn't have been more than 6. The canvas bore evidence of its hard journey: water stains along one edge, a tear through the upper corner that had been carefully mended with thread, and paint that had faded in places from exposure to the elements. "My family," Marcus said simply, holding the portrait where both Elira and Kaelen could see it. "My wife, Catherine, and my children, Thomas and little Mera." Elira leaned closer to study the painting, noting the obvious love that had guided the artist's brush. Despite the damage, the warmth and affection shared between the family members shone through clearly. The children's faces were bright with the kind of innocent joy that only childhood could provide, while Catherine's expression held the serene confidence of a woman who knew herself beloved. "They're beautiful," Elira said softly, meaning it completely. "Mera is the reason I'm here," Marcus continued, his finger tracing the outline of his daughter's face with infinite tenderness. 6 months ago, she began to waste away. No fever, no obvious illness, just a gradual fading like a flower dying of some invisible blight. The healers in our village tried everything: herbs, prayers, even consulting with physicians from the capital, but nothing helped. Kaelen found himself drawn closer, despite his intentions to remain aloof. There was something about the naked love in Marcus's voice that resonated with memories he had tried to bury. The merchant's devotion to his child echoed the fierce protectiveness Kaelen had once felt for Lyanna, the willingness to move heaven and earth for the sake of someone precious. A traveling scholar passed through our town and mentioned a legendary healer in these mountains, Marcus went on, carefully rewrapping the portrait. Elena of Millbrook, he called her. Said she possessed knowledge and medicines that bordered on the miraculous. I know it was foolish to risk the journey, especially with winter setting in. But you couldn't stand by and watch your daughter die, Elira finished quietly. Exactly. Marcus's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Catherine begged me not to go. She said we should accept God's will, that risking my life wouldn't bring Mira back if her time had truly come. But I can't. Give up as long as there's even the smallest chance of hope. The words hung in the cold air like a prayer, and Kaelen felt something twist painfully in his chest. Here was the kind of desperate love that had driven him to seek immortality all those centuries ago, the fierce refusal to accept loss that had ultimately damned his soul. But where Kaelen had chosen darkness and selfishness, Marcus had chosen sacrifice and selflessness. Elena was my mother, Elira said gently. She passed away 10 years ago, but I've tried to continue her work as best I can. Marcus's face fell, hope crumbling into despair so complete that even Kaelen felt a stab of sympathy. Then I've failed them, he whispered. I've traveled all this way for nothing, and now I'll never make it home in time to— That's not necessarily true, Elira interrupted, her mind racing through possibilities. My mother's knowledge lives on in her writings, and I've had some success treating wasting illnesses with a combination of spring tonics and strengthening elixirs. If you could describe Mira's symptoms in detail, I might be able to prepare something that could help her. But you used your last vial of the strong medicine to save me, Marcus protested. I saw you do it, that golden liquid that healed my wound completely. Without that, how can you possibly— There are other ways to heal, Elira said firmly, though her heart ached at the reminder of what she had sacrificed. My mother always taught me that love and determination can work miracles when combined with knowledge and skill. We'll find a way to help Mira. Kaelen watched this exchange with growing fascination and discomfort. The easy way these two mortals spoke of sacrifice and hope, their automatic assumption that love could conquer any obstacle, challenged everything he had learned about the nature of existence. For 800 years, he had believed that power was the only truth, that strength and fear were the only reliable currencies in a world governed by cruelty and chance. Yet here were two people who had never met before tonight, one risking her most precious possession to save the other, both now working together to save a child neither of them had ever seen. Their faith in the power of compassion was so absolute that it made his centuries of cynicism seem suddenly, devastatingly hollow. Tell me about her, Elira urged Marcus. Everything you can remember about when the illness began, how it progressed, what treatments were tried. Sometimes the smallest details can provide the key to understanding. As Marcus began to speak of his daughter's condition, describing her gradual loss of appetite, the way her skin had grown pale and translucent, how her once bright laughter had faded to barely audible whispers, Kaelen found himself listening with an attention that surprised him. The merchant's words painted a picture of a family torn apart by helpless watching, of parents taking turns sitting beside their child's bed through endless nights, of a community that had exhausted itself trying to save one small life. It was the kind of story that should have bored him. Mortal troubles, mortal pain, mortal love that meant nothing in the grand scheme of immortal existence. Instead, he discovered that it moved him in ways he had forgotten were possible, awakening echoes of the man he had been before grief and rage had transformed him into something monstrous. The storm had begun to ease, but the supernatural cold that emanated from Kaelen seemed to intensify as memories of his transformation surfaced unbidden. Around his brow, barely visible beneath his dark hair, a circlet of twisted metal caught the pale moonlight, the cursed crown of thorns that had been his constant companion for 8 centuries. As his emotional turmoil grew, the crown tightened perceptibly, its barbed edges pressing against his temples like a reminder of the price he had paid for immortality. "You ask how I became what I am," Kaelen said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated centuries. "The answer is simpler and more terrible than you might imagine." Elira had finished examining Marcus and determining that his recovery was progressing well. Now she sat back on her heels, her attention divided between the wounded man and the vampire, whose story was unfolding like a confession that had been 800 years in the making. "After Lyanna died," Kaelen continued, "I descended into a madness born of grief and rage. I had been raised to protect my people, to be their shield against harm, yet I had failed to save the one person who mattered most to me. The plague continued its rampage through our lands, and with each death, my sense of helplessness grew stronger. The crown of thorns pulsed with malevolent energy, feeding on the anguish that radiated from its wearer. It had been forged in the depths of hell itself, crafted specifically to bind souls to darkness through their own suffering. Every moment of pain, every surge of negative emotion, only strengthened its hold over the wearer's spirit. I began to search for answers in places no sane man would look," Kaelen went on, his red eyes fixed on some point beyond the visible world. Ancient texts spoke of beings who had conquered death itself, who possessed the power to reshape reality according to their will. I told myself that if I could gain such power, I could protect those I loved from any harm. I convinced myself that the ends would justify whatever means were necessary. Marcus stirred slightly, his merchant's instincts picking up on the undercurrents of supernatural energy that were building around them. He had traveled enough dangerous roads to recognize when he was in the presence of forces beyond mortal comprehension, but something in Kaelen's tone kept him from fleeing. There was genuine pain in the vampire's voice, a vulnerability that made him seem less like a predator and more like a man struggling with the weight of his own choices. "There was a witch," Kaelen continued, his hands clenching involuntarily as the crown tightened another degree. "Old beyond measure, dwelling in a cave system deep beneath the mountains. She claimed to possess knowledge of immortality, of power that could transcend the limitations of mortal flesh. The price she demanded seemed reasonable at the time. A year of service, helping her gather components for her dark rituals." Elira could see the crown now, its thorns gleaming with an oily darkness that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. She recognized it from the most forbidden sections of her mother's grimoire, a cursed artifact that fed on its wearer's suffering while slowly corrupting their soul. Her mother had written warnings about such devices, calling them soul traps designed to turn virtue into vice through constant torment. "What I didn't understand," Kaelen said, his voice growing softer and more distant, was that the witch fed on despair and moral corruption. Each task she set me grew progressively more heinous. First, I was to steal from grave sites, surely a minor transgression in service of a greater good. Then I was commanded to burn down a rival healer's shop, supposedly because her remedies were inferior to the witch's dark magic. The progression was as predictable as it was horrifying. Elira had read about such gradual seductions in her mother's texts, how evil rarely asked for everything at once, but instead demanded tiny compromises that accumulated over time until the victim found themselves so far from their original path that return seemed impossible. By the time I realized what was happening to my soul, I was already lost, Kaelen continued, touching the crown with fingers that trembled slightly. The final task she set me was to kill an innocent, a young mother who had discovered the witch's true nature and threatened to expose her to the authorities. I told myself it was just one life weighed against all the lives I could save with immortal power. But even as I drew my blade, I knew I had become everything I once opposed. Marcus was fully alert now, listening with the fascination of a man who understood the terrible weight of impossible choices. As a father, he could comprehend the desperation that would drive someone to seek power at any cost. But he could also see the horror of where such choices led. When the deed was done, Kaelen went on, the witch fulfilled her part of our bargain. She performed the ritual of transformation, binding my soul to undeath and granting me the immortality I had sought. But immortality, I discovered, was not the blessing I had imagined. She placed this crown upon my head as the final seal of our pact, a device that would ensure I could never find peace, never escape the consequences of what I had become. The crown pulsed with renewed malevolence, as if responding to being discussed. Its thorns drew tiny beads of blood from Kaelen's temples, blood that was absorbed immediately back into the cursed metal to fuel its dark power. Every evil act I have committed since then has been both a choice and a compulsion, Kaelen explained, his voice heavy with self-loathing. The crown feeds on suffering, both that which I inflict and that which I experience. It grows stronger with each kill, each act of cruelty, each moment of despair. In exchange, it grants me supernatural power and the ability to influence the minds of mortals. Elira found herself moved by the anguish in his confession, but she also recognized the dangerous trap of such thinking. "But you still have choice," she said firmly. "Even with that thing on your head, even after 8 centuries, you chose not to kill us tonight. You chose to listen to Marcus's story, to remember what love looked like. Those were your decisions, not the crown's." Kaelen looked at her with something approaching wonder. "You truly believe that? After everything I've told you about what I've done, what I've become?" "I believe that redemption is possible for anyone willing to pay its price," Elira replied, echoing her mother's teachings. "But the choice has to be yours. No crown, no witch, no curse can take away your fundamental ability to choose love over fear, compassion over cruelty." The words struck Kaelen like physical blows, causing the crown to constrict so violently that he gasped in pain. But beneath the agony, something else stirred, a tiny spark of the man he had once been, fighting to rekindle itself despite 8 centuries of darkness. Elira's hand moved instinctively to her leather herb pouch, fingers brushing against something she had forgotten was there, a small silk sachet that her mother had placed among her traveling supplies years ago. As she drew it out, the fabric seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, revealing the dried petals of moonflowers that had somehow retained their ethereal luminescence despite their age. "Moonflower petals," she whispered in wonder, holding the sachet up to catch what little light filtered through the storm clouds. Kaelen recoiled as if she had brandished a weapon, his red eyes widening with something that might have been fear. The crown of thorns contracted violently around his head, drawing fresh blood that was immediately absorbed into the cursed metal. The very air around him seemed to ripple with supernatural tension, as if the fabric of reality itself was responding to the presence of something fundamentally opposed to his dark nature. "Put those away," he commanded, his voice harsh with panic. "You don't understand what those can do." "My mother always said they were sacred," Elira replied, studying the petals more closely. Even dried and aged, they retained an otherworldly beauty that made her heart ache with hope. "She told me they bloomed only under very specific conditions, when someone was about to make a choice that would change the course of their destiny." Marcus watched the exchange with growing fascination, his merchant's eye noting how the vampire's entire demeanor had shifted at the sight of the flowers. Where before Kaelen had seemed composed despite his inner turmoil, now he appeared genuinely frightened, as if confronting something that threatened his very existence. "The legends speak of their power to purify even the most corrupted souls," Elira continued, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence her mother had used when recounting the old stories. "It said that when freely given to one who has lost their way, moonflowers can restore what was thought permanently destroyed: hope, love, the capacity for redemption." "Fairy tales," Kaelen snarled, but his protest lacked conviction. "Pretty stories to comfort children afraid of the dark." "Then why do they terrify you so?" Marcus asked quietly, his question cutting through the vampire's defenses with unexpected precision. Kaelen fell silent, his perfect features contorting with an internal struggle that was painful to witness. The crown pulsed with renewed malevolence, its thorns digging deeper as it sensed the threat posed by the sacred flowers. For 8 centuries, it had fed on his despair and self-hatred, growing stronger with each act of evil he committed. The possibility of genuine redemption was anathema to its very existence. "Because I've seen what they can do," Kaelen finally admitted, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Long ago, in the early years after my transformation, I encountered a man, a priest who had fallen into darkness much as I had. He carried moonflower petals that his dying sister had given him, and when he chose to use them to save others rather than himself." He paused, unable or unwilling to continue the story, but Elira could see the truth in his eyes. The flowers worked. They possessed genuine power to transform even the most fallen souls, but only when freely given in an act of perfect selflessness. "What happened to him?" she pressed gently. "He became human again," Kaelen whispered. "Mortal, vulnerable, but somehow more alive than he had been in decades. The darkness that had consumed him burned away like mist before the dawn, and he walked back into the world as if reborn." The admission hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Here was proof that redemption was not just a comforting myth, but a tangible possibility, real and immediate and terrifying in its implications. If such transformation was possible for others, then perhaps it was possible for Kaelen as well. "My mother used to tell me stories about people who had forgotten how to feel," Elira said softly, cradling the sachet of moonflower petals in her palm. "She said that love was like a flame that could never truly be extinguished, only buried beneath layers of pain and fear. Sometimes it took something sacred to help people remember what they had lost." Marcus nodded slowly, his thoughts turning to his own family and the love that had driven him across dangerous territory in search of healing for his daughter. "When Myra first fell ill," he said, "Catherine and I were so afraid of losing her that we almost forgot to cherish the time we still had with her. It wasn't until I made the decision to seek help, to choose hope over despair, that I remembered how precious every moment with her truly was." Kaelen listened to their words with growing agitation, the crown's influence warring against something deeper and more fundamental in his nature. For centuries, he had told himself that his capacity for love had died with Lyanna, that the monster he had become was all that remained of Lord Kaelen Blackthorn. But watching Elira's selfless compassion, hearing Marcus's devoted love for his family, he felt stirrings of emotions he had thought permanently buried. "I don't know how to feel anymore," he confessed, the words torn from him like splinters from a wound. 800 years of feeding on fear and pain, 800 years of the crown's poison flowing through my thoughts. I've forgotten what it means to care about anything beyond survival and power. "But you cared enough to spare us," Elira pointed out. "You cared enough to listen to our stories, to share your own pain with strangers who should be nothing more than prey to you. That caring didn't come from the crown. It came from the part of you that remembers what love feels like." The moonflower petals seemed to pulse with gentle radiance, responding to the emotional currents swirling around them. Ancient magic stirred in the winter air, the kind of deep, transformative power that appeared only when souls stood at the crossroads between damnation and salvation. "I killed her," Kaelen said suddenly, his voice breaking like a dam under immense pressure. "The young mother, the witch's final test. I looked into her eyes as she died, saw her children's faces reflected there, and I felt nothing. Nothing at all. How can someone who has become capable of such emptiness ever hope to feel again?" "Because feeling isn't about forgetting the darkness," Marcus said with quiet wisdom, born of his own struggles. "It's about choosing light despite the darkness. Every day I wake up afraid that today might be the day we lose Mira. But I choose to love her anyway, choose to hope anyway, choose to fight for her anyway. That's what makes us human. Not the absence of darkness, but the decision to kindle light in spite of it." The words struck Kaelen with the force of revelation, causing him to stagger backward as if physically wounded. The crown constricted so violently that drops of blood ran down his temples, but for the first time in centuries, he felt something other than pain flowing through his consciousness, a tiny spark of warmth that might have been hope. The spark of hope that had ignited in Kaelen's consciousness seemed to resonate through the very air around them, causing the moonflower petals to glow more brightly and the supernatural cold to ease slightly. But with that small victory came an unexpected consequence. The crown of thorns began to pulse with an urgent, almost panicked energy, as if sensing that its hold on its host was weakening for the first time in centuries. Elira felt compelled to reach deeper into her mother's traveling supplies, her fingers searching for something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Hidden beneath layers of carefully wrapped herbs, her hand closed around a small object wrapped in midnight blue silk. As she drew it forth, both Marcus and Kaelen leaned closer, sensing that whatever lay beneath the cloth was significant beyond ordinary measure. "I had forgotten this was here," Elira murmured, carefully unwrapping the object to reveal a fragment of what appeared to be a mirror. No larger than her palm, but possessed of such perfect clarity that it seemed to contain infinite depths. The surface rippled with an opalescent sheen that suggested it was made of something far more precious than ordinary glass. Kaelen's reaction was immediate and violent. He stumbled backward as if the fragment had burst into flame, his hands flying up to shield his face from its presence. "A soul mirror," he gasped, his voice filled with a terror that went bone deep. "How did your mother come to possess such a thing?" "What is it?" Marcus asked, studying the fragment with curious eyes. To him, it appeared to be nothing more than an unusually clear piece of broken mirror, beautiful but seemingly harmless. "It shows truth," Elira replied, though she was uncertain how she knew this. The knowledge seemed to flow from the artifact itself, filling her mind with understanding that felt both foreign and familiar. "Not just physical appearance, but the true nature of whoever looks into it. The soul laid bare, without pretense or deception. "Your mother never told you how she acquired it," Kaelen demanded, still maintaining his distance from the mirror fragment. Elira shook her head, but even as she did, memories began to surface. Half-remembered conversations from her childhood, stories her mother had told in hushed tones when she thought her daughter was sleeping. She used to speak of a time when she encountered great evil and chose mercy over vengeance, she said slowly. She said it was the defining moment of her life, the choice that shaped everything that came after. The fragment seemed to pulse with inner light, responding to the emotional currents swirling around them. Its surface began to show images, not reflections of the present, but glimpses of the past, scenes playing out, like ghostly theatre in its crystalline depths. "Look," Marcus breathed, pointing to the swirling images within the mirror. The first scene showed a younger Elena, recognizable despite the decades that separated that moment from the present. She stood in a cottage much like the one Elira now called home, but her posture spoke of terrible fear. Before her loomed a figure cloaked in darkness, red eyes burning with supernatural hunger, Kaelen, but as he had been decades ago, when his transformation to monster was still recent and incomplete. "I remember," Kaelen whispered, his voice filled with wonder and horror. "It was 43 years ago. I had come to her village during a plague outbreak, drawn by the scent of death and suffering. I intended to feed on the dying, to add their final moments of terror to the crown's collection of agonies." The images in the mirror shifted, showing Eleanor working tirelessly among the sick, her hands gentle as she administered medicine and comfort to those beyond all other hope. Even in the face of certain death, she moved with the same selfless grace that Elira had inherited, never thinking of her own safety when others needed her help. "But when I found her," Kaelen continued, his eyes fixed on the unfolding scenes, "she wasn't cowering in fear or trying to flee. She was kneeling beside a child who was dying of the fever, holding the little one's hand and singing a lullaby to ease her passing. She looked up at me, this creature of nightmare standing in her doorway, and the first words out of her mouth were, 'Can you help her?' The mirror showed that moment in perfect clarity. Elena's face turned toward the vampire, her eyes bright with tears, but filled with desperate hope rather than terror. She had recognized him for what he was. Any healer would have sensed the supernatural darkness that surrounded him, but her first thought had been for her patient, not herself. "I told her the child was beyond saving," Kaelen remembered, his voice growing softer. "I explained that I was there to feed, not to heal. But she didn't accept that. She offered herself, her own life, her own blood, if I would somehow spare the child. Not because she knew any way I could save the little one, but simply because she couldn't bear the thought of not trying everything possible." Marcus watched the unfolding revelation with growing amazement, beginning to understand the deeper connections that had brought them together on this storm-swept night. This was not coincidence or mere chance. This was destiny, a pattern that had been weaving itself across decades to reach this moment of convergence. The mirror's images showed what happened next. Kaelen, moved despite himself by Elena's selfless offer, had indeed spared both woman and child. He had left the village without feeding, walking away from easy prey, because something in Elena's compassion had awakened an echo of his former humanity. "That was the first time in decades that I chose mercy over hunger," Kaelen admitted. "The crown punished me terribly for it. 3 days of agony beyond description. But somehow the pain seemed less important than the memory of your mother's courage. She saved more than the child's life that night. She saved something in me that I thought was permanently dead." "The little girl," Elira said suddenly, her eyes widening with understanding. "What happened to her?" The mirror showed the answer. The child recovering, growing up to become a woman of remarkable strength and compassion. The woman who would become Marcus's wife, Catherine. "My Catherine," Marcus breathed, staring at the images in wonder. "But how is that possible? She never mentioned. Children often don't remember near-death experiences clearly," Elira explained, her healer's knowledge filling in the gaps. "And parents sometimes choose not to burden their children with traumatic memories. But the influence remains. The lesson of selfless love, witnessed in her earliest years, would have shaped everything about who she became." The final images in the soul mirror showed the connections that bound all their lives together. Catherine growing up to embody the same spirit of selfless love that Elena had shown, teaching that same compassion to her children, inspiring Marcus to risk everything for their daughter's sake. And through it all, the ripple effects of one moment of mercy granted by a vampire who remembered, however briefly, what it meant to be human. "You see now why I cannot look into that mirror directly," Kaelen said, his voice heavy with significance. "It would show me what I truly am, stripped of all pretense and self-deception. For 8 centuries I've told myself that the monster is all that remains of Kaelen Blackthorn. But your mother's memory lives on in your compassion. Catherine's love flows through Marcus's devotion to his family, and the child I spared grew up to create more love in the world." The mirror fragment pulsed with brilliant light, and suddenly Elira understood its true purpose. "It's not just showing us the past," she realized. "It's showing us that redemption has been possible all along. Every choice for mercy creates ripples that spread outward, touching lives across decades. The man you used to be isn't dead, Kaelen. He's been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to awaken." The revelation hung between them like a bridge across the abyss of centuries, connecting past and present, linking 3 souls who had been shaped by the same moment of grace. The storm around them began to intensify again, but now it felt less like nature's fury and more like the universe itself, responding to the magnitude of what was unfolding in their small clearing. For the first time since his transformation, Kaelen found himself believing that change was not just possible, but inevitable. The mirror had shown him the truth he had been afraid to face. That love, once given, never truly dies but waits patiently for the moment when it can bloom again. The revelation contained within the soul mirror fragment had barely settled into their consciousness when the very air around them began to change. What had been the natural cold of a winter storm transformed into something far more sinister. A supernatural chill that penetrated to the bone and carried with it the scent of ancient graves and forgotten terrors. The trees surrounding their clearing creaked ominously, though no wind stirred their branches, and shadows began to move independently of any light source. Kaelen's head snapped up, his red eyes scanning the forest with predatory alertness. "They're coming," he said, his voice tight with grim recognition. "My kind. They've sensed what's happening here." "Your kind?" Elira asked, though she already suspected the answer would chill her to the core. "Other vampires," Kaelen confirmed, rising to his feet with fluid grace despite the crown's attempts to weaken him through pain. "The crown is not merely a torture device. It's a beacon that connects me to others of my nature. When it senses the possibility of redemption, it sends out a call that summons every vampire within hundreds of miles. Marcus struggled to stand, still weak from his recent healing, but determined not to face whatever was coming while lying helpless on the ground. Why would they come? What do they want with us? Kaelen's expression was grim as he explained the terrible truth. In the hierarchy of the undead, redemption is seen as the ultimate betrayal. A vampire who chooses to return to humanity threatens the very foundations of our existence. If word spread that such transformation was possible, it could inspire others to seek the same path. The vampire lords cannot allow that precedent to be set. The shadows deepened around them, and Elira could now see shapes moving through the trees, pale figures that glided between the trunks with inhuman grace, their eyes glowing like crimson stars in the darkness. There were at least a dozen of them, perhaps more, and all possessed the same terrible beauty that marked the truly ancient undead. From among her mother's traveling supplies, Elira withdrew an ornate dagger that she had never had cause to use before. Its blade was inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the pale light, and its handle was carved from what appeared to be blessed wood. As she held it, knowledge flowed into her mind. This was no ordinary weapon, but a tool of sacrifice that could either take life or offer it, depending on the intentions of the one who wielded it. The blade of choice, Kaelen breathed, recognizing the weapon from legends he had thought were myth. Your mother carried one of the 7 sacred daggers. Where did she acquire such a thing? I'm beginning to think my mother was much more than a simple village healer, Elira replied, testing the weight of the blade in her hand. Despite its ornate appearance, it felt perfectly balanced, as if it had been crafted specifically for her grip. This feels familiar, even though I've never held it before. The approaching vampires had formed a loose circle around their clearing, close enough now that their individual features were visible. They were a collection of different eras and origins. Some wore the refined clothing of ancient nobility, others the simpler garb of common folk who had been transformed against their will, but all shared the same expression of cold hunger and righteous indignation at what they perceived as Kaelen's betrayal of their shared nature. Lord Kaelen, called out a voice from the shadows, melodious and terrifying in its beauty. You have forgotten yourself, old friend. The speaker stepped into the pale moonlight, a female vampire of extraordinary beauty, with silver hair that flowed like liquid metal and eyes that burned with the cold fire of distant stars. Her clothing marked her as nobility from a bygone age, and the aura of power that surrounded her suggested she was among the eldest of their kind. Lady Seraphina, Kaelen acknowledged with a slight bow that managed to convey both respect and defiance. I should have expected you would be the first to arrive. When the Crown's distress call reached us, I could scarcely believe its message, Seraphina continued, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. Kaelen Blackthorn, the shadow of the northern peaks, consorting with mortals and entertaining thoughts of redemption. Surely there must be some mistake. There is no mistake, Kaelen replied firmly, and as he spoke, Elira could see him making a choice that would define everything that followed. I remember what it feels like to love without conditions, to protect without expecting reward, to choose mercy over vengeance. These mortals have shown me that the man I once was is not truly dead, merely sleeping. A chorus of hisses arose from the assembled vampires, the sound like steam escaping from a dozen kettles. The very concept of voluntary redemption was anathema to their existence, a rejection of everything they had become and everything they represented. You speak of love and mercy, Seraphina said with cold amusement, but have you forgotten the countless lives you have taken in service to your hunger? Do you think the families of your victims would welcome your redemption? Do you believe their forgiveness would somehow wash away 8 centuries of blood and terror? The words struck Kaelen like physical blows, causing the crown to constrict with renewed violence. Doubt began to creep into his consciousness. Perhaps he was being foolish to believe that someone who had committed such atrocities could ever truly change. Perhaps the darkness had claimed him so completely that redemption was nothing more than a cruel illusion. But then Elira stepped forward, the sacred dagger gleaming in her hand like a beacon of hope. "Redemption isn't about erasing the past," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom her mother had instilled in her. "It's about choosing to create a different future. Every moment offers us the chance to be better than we were, to love more deeply than we did before." Marcus moved to stand beside her, his merchant's courage bolstered by his love for his family and his growing understanding of what was at stake. "My wife Catherine was saved by this man's mercy 43 years ago," he declared. "Because he chose compassion over hunger in that moment, she lived to become a woman who spreads love wherever she goes. That single choice has created ripples of goodness that will continue long after we're all gone." The vampires surrounding them grew agitated, their forms shifting restlessly, as the mortal's words challenged the fundamental assumptions of their existence. For creatures who had defined themselves by their separation from humanity, the suggestion that love could bridge that gap was deeply threatening. "Enough of this foolishness," Seraphina snapped, her beautiful features twisting with rage. "If Kaelen will not remember his true nature willingly, we shall remind him. Kill the mortals, and let their blood on his hands restore his proper understanding of what he is." The circle of vampires began to close in, their movements coordinated with the precision of pack hunters. Elira raised the sacred dagger, its blade beginning to glow with inner light that seemed to push back against the supernatural darkness. Marcus positioned himself protectively between the vampires and the still recovering form of the man whose life he owed to Elira's compassion. But it was Kaelen who surprised them all. Instead of retreating or attempting to negotiate, he stepped forward to place himself between the approaching threat and the 2 mortals who had shown him what redemption looked like. The crown of thorns pulsed with agony as it fought against his protective instincts, but for the first time in centuries, he ignored its influence entirely. "If you want their blood," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 8 centuries of supernatural power, "you'll have to go through me first." The declaration sent shock waves through the assembled vampires. For one of their kind to actively protect mortals was unprecedented, a violation of everything they understood about the natural order. But Seraphina merely smiled, her expression holding all the cruelty and calculation of the truly ancient undead. "So be it," she said, raising her hand in a gesture that caused the very air to crackle with dark energy. "If you have chosen to stand with mortals, then you shall die as one. But know this, Kaelen, your death will not be quick, and neither will theirs. We shall make sure you live long enough to watch them suffer for your foolish sentimentality." The battle lines were drawn, and as the supernatural forces gathered their strength for the assault, Elira found herself strangely calm. She understood now why her mother had carried the sacred dagger, why she had possessed the soul mirror fragment, why she had filled her daughter's traveling supplies with moonflower petals and ancient wisdom. This moment had been approaching for decades, a convergence of destinies that would determine not just their individual fates, but the very nature of redemption itself. In her free hand, she clutched the silk sachet containing the moonflower petals, their ethereal glow providing a counterpoint to the malevolent energies swirling around them. Whatever happened in the coming confrontation, she was determined that love would have its chance to triumph over centuries of accumulated darkness. The attack came without warning, a coordinated assault that spoke to centuries of experience in supernatural warfare. Lady Seraphina raised her hands, and the very air itself became a weapon. Invisible forces slammed into Kaelen with the force of a battering ram, sending him staggering backward, even as other vampires materialized from the shadows like wraiths given solid form. Elira felt something warm against her chest and looked down to see a small charm she hadn't noticed before. A delicate phoenix feather that glowed with soft golden light. It had been hidden beneath her mother's locket, and now it pulsed with increasing brilliance as the supernatural battle erupted around them. The charm seemed to respond to her willingness to risk everything for others, its light growing stronger with each selfless thought that crossed her mind. The phoenix charm, Marcus breathed, recognizing the artifact from legends his grandmother had told him as a child. It reveals itself only to those willing to sacrifice themselves for others. Kaelen fought with desperate fury, his vampiric strength matched against adversaries who possessed similar supernatural abilities. But 8 centuries of the Crown's torment had taken their toll. His movements were slightly slower than they should have been, his reflexes dulled by constant pain. When a vampire with the appearance of a medieval knight struck him with a blade wreathed in shadow, dark blood flowed freely from the wound. "You fight for mortals now?" the night vampire snarled, pressing his attack. "How far the mighty have fallen?" "I fight for the right to choose my own path," Kaelen replied, deflecting another strike while maneuvering to keep his opponents away from Elira and Marcus. Elira raised the sacred dagger, its blessed blade cutting through the supernatural darkness that one of the vampires had conjured around her. The weapon moved in her hands with a will of its own, guided by instincts she had inherited from generations of healers who had learned to defend the innocent. When a pale woman with Victorian dress lunged toward Marcus, Elira intercepted the attack, her blade meeting claws that sparked with unholy fire. "You cannot win, little healer," the Victorian vampire hissed. "We are legion, and you are merely human." "Perhaps," Elira replied, feeling the phoenix feather's warmth spread through her chest. "But I'm a human who has chosen love over fear." The feather's glow intensified, and suddenly Marcus could see what Elira had known instinctively. The charm was not merely decorative, but a focusing lens for the kind of sacrifice that could change the fundamental nature of reality itself. As the 3 of them fought back to back against overwhelming odds, their individual acts of protection for one another caused the charm to blaze like a miniature sun. Marcus, despite his recent injuries and lack of supernatural abilities, proved surprisingly effective in combat. His travels as a merchant had taught him to defend himself against bandits and wild animals, and his desperate love for his family gave him strength beyond his physical limitations. When 2 vampires attempted to flank Kaelen during his duel with Seraphina, Marcus threw himself into their path, his ordinary steel knife somehow finding gaps in their supernatural defenses. "Why do you fight for him?" one of the vampires demanded, as Marcus barely dodged a swipe that would have taken his head off. "He is a monster. He would have killed you without hesitation before tonight." "Because people can change," Marcus replied, rolling under another attack and coming up to strike at his opponent's knee. "Because redemption is possible for anyone willing to pay its price." The phoenix feather responded to his words, its light expanding to encompass all 3 of them in a protective aura. The vampire's attack still connected, still drew blood and caused pain. But there was something different about the wounds now. They healed faster, hurt less, and seemed unable to inflict permanent damage as long as the 3 continued to fight for each other, rather than merely for themselves. Kaelen felt the change most acutely. For the first time in 8 centuries, the crown of thorns was not drawing strength from his pain and anger. Instead, his power seemed to flow from the same source that fed the phoenix feather, the willingness to sacrifice for others. His movements became faster, more fluid, and when he struck back at his attackers, his blows carried the weight of righteous purpose rather than mere survival instinct. "This is impossible," Seraphina snarled, her perfect features twisted with frustration. "The crown should be making you stronger, feeding on the violence and terror around us. Why do you grow more powerful instead of weaker?" "Because I'm no longer fighting for myself," Kaelen replied, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised even him. "I'm fighting for them, for the future they represent, for the possibility of becoming worthy of their friendship." The admission caused the crown to convulse with agony, its thorns digging so deep that blood flowed freely down Kaelen's face. But the pain no longer controlled him. It was simply another obstacle to overcome in service of something greater than his own existence. The first phase of the battle ended with heavy losses on both sides, but the vampires were clearly shaken by what they had witnessed. The phoenix feather continued to burn with golden radiance, a beacon of hope in the supernatural darkness that surrounded them. As the battle reached its crescendo, Lady Seraphina produced an artifact that made even the ancient vampires surrounding her step back in awe and terror. The heart's blood chalice materialized in her hands, a cup carved from obsidian and lined with silver, its surface etched with runes that seemed to writhe and twist of their own accord. This was the legendary vessel that could either damn a soul forever or set it free, depending on the nature of the blood willingly offered to fill it. "If you truly wish redemption, Kaelen," Seraphina called out, her voice cutting through the chaos of combat, "then let us test your commitment. The chalice demands freely given blood to complete any transformation. But whose blood will you choose? Your own, to purchase your freedom, or theirs, to maintain the power that has sustained you for 8 centuries? The other vampires ceased their attacks, forming a circle around the clearing as ancient laws older than written history came into effect. When the heart's blood chalice appeared, all supernatural conflicts were suspended until its judgment was rendered. The cup floated between Seraphina's hands, pulsing with an inner darkness that seemed to devour light itself. Kaelen stared at the chalice with recognition and horror. He had heard legends of the artifact, but had never believed it truly existed. The choice it presented was absolute. There could be no half measures, no compromises. Either he would sacrifice himself to save the mortals he had come to care for, or he would sacrifice them to maintain his immortal existence. "The choice is simple," Seraphina continued, her voice honeyed with false sympathy. "Fill the chalice with their blood, and your power will be restored tenfold. You will rule as a vampire lord with authority over all who witness this moment. Or fill it with your own blood and burn away in mortal flame, returning to the weakness and brevity of human existence." Elira stepped forward without hesitation, the phoenix feather blazing against her chest like a star. "Then the choice is no choice at all," she said, extending her wrist toward the floating chalice. "If my blood can free him from centuries of torment, then I give it gladly." "And mine as well," Marcus added, moving to stand beside her, despite the weakness that still plagued him from his recent healing. "This man spared my wife 43 years ago, creating ripples of love that led to my daughter's birth. If my blood can complete that circle of grace, then take it." The offer of freely given sacrifice sent shock waves through the assembled vampires. Never in their long existence had they witnessed mortals willingly offering their lives to redeem one of their kind. The very concept challenged everything they believed about the fundamental nature of humanity and the unbridgeable gulf between mortal and immortal. Kaelen felt the crown of thorns constrict with such violence that his vision blurred with pain. But beneath the agony, something else was happening. The willing sacrifice offered by Elira and Marcus was awakening powers in the chalice that had nothing to do with darkness or damnation. Instead of its usual obsidian black, the cup began to glow with the same golden radiance that emanated from the phoenix feather. "No," he said firmly, stepping between his mortal friends and the floating artifact. "Your blood is too precious to waste on someone like me. If transformation requires sacrifice, then let it be my sacrifice, alone." He drew the sacred dagger from Elira's hand, its blessed blade feeling warm and right in his grip. Without hesitation, he drew it across his palm, letting his dark blood flow into the chalice. But as the crimson drops struck the vessel's interior, something miraculous occurred. Instead of the expected burst of malevolent power, the blood transformed into liquid light. The transformation was not his alone to make, Kaelen realized with sudden understanding. Elira and Marcus stepped forward as one, each taking the dagger in turn to add their own blood to the mixture. The chalice accepted their offerings eagerly, the combined sacrifice of vampire, healer, and merchant creating an alchemical reaction that had never been witnessed before. "Impossible," Seraphina breathed, her perfect composure cracking for the first time in millennia. "The chalice feeds on darkness, on the corruption of pure souls. It cannot—" Her words were cut off as the vessel erupted with radiance that banished every shadow from the clearing. The light was not harsh or blinding, but warm and welcoming, like sunlight filtered through stained glass windows. It poured over Kaelen in waves, and wherever it touched, his vampiric nature began to burn away like morning mist. The crown of thorns convulsed one final time before cracking down its center, its hold on his soul finally broken after 8 centuries of torment. As the cursed artifact crumbled to dust, Kaelen felt his heart begin to beat for the first time since his transformation. Slowly at first, then with increasing strength and regularity. The assembled vampires fled as the light expanded outward, unable to withstand the purifying force that emanated from the chalice. Even Seraphina, for all her ancient power, dissolved into shadow and mist rather than face what she had inadvertently unleashed. When the light finally faded, Kaelen collapsed to his knees in the snow, gasping as mortal breath filled lungs that had known only the stillness of death for centuries. His pale skin had taken on the warmth of life. His red eyes had returned to the deep blue they had been in his human youth. And most miraculous of all, he could feel, truly feel, for the first time since Lyanna's death. The first rays of dawn broke through the dissipating storm clouds, painting the snow-covered clearing in shades of rose and gold. As the supernatural darkness that had plagued the forest for centuries finally lifted, something extraordinary began to happen throughout the woods surrounding them. Flowers that had never been seen before started to bloom in the pristine snow. New dawn roses, their petals shimmering with an opalescent beauty that seemed to capture and reflect every color of the sunrise. Kaelen knelt in the center of the clearing, his transformation complete but overwhelming in its totality. After 800 years of supernatural existence, mortality felt both alien and wonderfully familiar. He could feel the cold seeping through his clothes, could taste the crisp mountain air on his tongue, could hear his heart beating a steady rhythm that synchronized with the life force flowing through his renewed body. "How do you feel?" Elira asked gently, kneeling beside him in the snow. The phoenix feather still glowed softly against her chest, though its radiance had mellowed to a warm, comforting light rather than the blazing beacon it had been during the battle. "Alive," Kaelen replied, his voice filled with wonder. "Truly, completely alive, for the first time in centuries. The Crown's voice is gone from my mind. The hunger that drove me for so long has vanished, and I can feel—" He paused, struggling to find words for experiences he had thought lost forever. "I can feel joy, Elira. Pure, uncomplicated joy at simply being here with both of you." Marcus had been examining the new dawn roses that were spreading throughout the clearing, his merchant's eye noting their otherworldly beauty. "These flowers," he said with growing excitement. "They're not just beautiful, I can feel power radiating from them. Healing power, stronger than anything I've ever encountered." Elira moved to study the nearest bloom, her healer's instincts immediately recognizing what Marcus had sensed. The new dawn roses possessed the same kind of pure, transformative energy that had flowed from the heart's blood chalice, but gentled and refined into a form that could bring healing rather than dramatic change. "They're growing from the spots where the chalice's light touched the ground," she observed, carefully picking one of the flowers and feeling its petals pulse with warmth. "I think these are a gift, a sign that what we did here tonight will continue to spread healing and hope long after we're gone." As the sun climbed higher, the transformation of the forest became even more apparent. Trees that had been twisted by supernatural malevolence straightened and flourished, their branches reaching toward the light with renewed vigor. The very air seemed cleaner and more vibrant, as if the purification that had restored Kaelen's humanity had extended to encompass the entire region. "My daughter," Marcus said suddenly, his eyes lighting up with realization. "If these flowers possess such healing power, then perhaps they're exactly what Mira needs," Elira finished, understanding immediately. She began gathering the new dawn roses carefully, her experienced hands knowing instinctively how to harvest them for maximum potency. "We can prepare a tincture that should restore her strength and vitality. It won't be the exact medicine you originally sought, but I believe it will be even more effective." Kaelen watched them work together, marveling at how naturally they moved to help one another. This was what he had forgotten during his centuries of darkness, the simple beauty of cooperation, the joy that came from using one's abilities in service of others rather than for personal gain. "There's something I need to tell both of you," he said, as they prepared for the journey back to civilization. "The vampire who created me, the witch who bound my soul to darkness, she drew her power from human suffering. With my transformation back to mortality, that power has been broken. Others who were trapped as I was will begin to feel the possibility of redemption stirring in their own hearts." The implications were staggering. If Kaelen's transformation had indeed weakened the forces that kept other vampires bound to their cursed existence, then the ripples of this night's events would spread far beyond their small clearing. Across the world, creatures who had thought themselves forever damned might begin to remember what it felt like to hope. "Will you return to your old lands?" Elira asked. "Try to reclaim your mortal inheritance?" Kaelen considered the question seriously. Those lands belong to others now, and rightfully so. The man who once ruled there died 8 centuries ago. I am someone new, born from his ashes, but not bound by his past. I think I would like to learn what it means to build a life rather than simply endure one." "Then stay," Elira said simply. "Help me continue my mother's work. The valley will need healers now that the supernatural threat has been lifted, and you have knowledge of herbs and remedies from centuries of observation. We could do much good together." The offer touched something deep in Kaelen's renewed heart. For 800 years he had existed in isolation, cut off from meaningful connection by the nature of his curse. The possibility of partnership, of shared purpose and mutual support was more precious than any treasure he had accumulated during his dark reign. "And when spring comes," Marcus added, "you must both visit my family. Catherine will want to thank you personally for what you've done. And Mira," his voice caught with emotion, "Mira will want to meet the people who made her healing possible." They walked together through the forest as the morning sun climbed higher, their path illuminated by the continuing bloom of new dawn roses that marked their passage. Behind them, Kaelen's ancient castle stood empty and harmless, its dark towers catching the sunlight and reflecting it back in brilliant displays that spoke of transformation and hope. The story that had begun with a simple act of mercy in a snow-covered clearing had become something far greater, a testament to the power of love to transcend any barrier, to heal any wound, to redeem any soul willing to pay the price of change. And as the new dawn roses continued to bloom in their footsteps, that story would live on, inspiring others to choose compassion over cruelty, sacrifice over selfishness, love over fear. In the distance, church bells began to ring, welcoming the dawn and the promise of new beginnings that it brought.